The objective today is to deduce why a certain amount of RAM is useful to particular types of processors. So here's a bit of a table of contents for you. The first thing we'll go over is what is RAM, and then we'll talk about how it is related to the CPU. I'll do a mini photo gallery, especially if you're a visual learner, this should help out. And then we'll go over some examples from real life. After that, we'll talk about what an instruction set means, and then relate all this to the big picture. After that, opportunities for creativity, and then an opportunity for extended learning, and finally we'll do the Today I Learned / DOL, basically the prove that you had learned today. So as an introduction, let's remember that there are three things that a computer does. It stores data, it transmits data, and it processes data. How does RAM fit into all this? Well, RAM stores data so the processor can get to it really, really fast, as opposed to something like a hard drive. So, think, write, share, what is the purpose of RAM? And if you need to go back to use some of my words to help you with yours, go ahead. RAM and processors go hand in hand, and when shopping for a computer, you might notice 4, 8, or even 16 gigabytes of RAM will come with any particular computer you're looking at. And on that same computer, you may have a CPU with 1.6 all the way through to 2.5 gigahertz, and this is just on average. Unless we're talking about the Ryzen chip, that's new during the making of this video here, and I saw that they are claiming up to 4.35 gigahertz, which is pretty blazingly fast. But typically you're not going to buy a computer. Your average consumer isn't going to buy a computer right now, as of 2018, faster than 2.5 gigahertz. Anything higher would likely need to be cooled with liquid nitrogen. So why are these numbers together? Well, nowadays all chips seem to have what's called a 64-bit instruction set. That means if you see 8 gigabytes of RAM, you're almost guaranteed to have a 64-bit processor. And I say almost in case somebody is strange and they upgrade their chip or RAM maybe in a weird way. Maybe they have a 32-bit chip and they want to put 8 gigabytes of RAM in. That would be very strange and not worth their money. But when you're scouring on eBay, you never know what you're going to find. And notice I use the XOR here, as in if you're just upgrading one thing or the other and it's not compatible or it's creating a bottleneck in your system, well, that doesn't make very much sense. So I put an XOR right here next to the word weird, because that would be weird. And so far I'm talking about chips and RAM. Let's just ground ourselves in what I'm talking about. A chip, or a CPU, also called a processor. CPU stands for Central Processing Unit. This is a nice up-close view of a chip. And these are the pins in a chip. And you could probably guess here that what these pins do is allow voltage to travel through them. And so here's more of a bird's eye view of a CPU. Here's the back side. This is the side you probably see if you were to open up a computer and you're looking at the motherboard. Like, here's what you would see. But if you were to take it out and flip it over, here is the chip with all the pins. Typically, this is maybe the single most expensive component of any given computer. I was looking at a computer on Amazon the other day, and the chip was like 80% of the price. Another bird's eye view of a chip here. So they can be small. If we're talking about a chip, we're not necessarily talking about a CPU, that is the central processing unit. So they could be smaller, just so you know. And then here is a CPU, and that is the fancy little device that you put it in, and it clips down. And then of course you put some gunk on it so it sticks, and the gunk is like glue, so it doesn't melt. It's a very special kind of glue. Okay, and if I'm talking about chips and CPUs, let me just quickly mention what a GPU is. This is a very specialized type of chip. When people talk about graphics cards or video cards, the most expensive piece on that card will always be the GPU. That is the graphical processing unit. And later on, we'll learn the difference between GPUs and CPUs. If you just can't wait, I'd recommend watching this video by the Mythbuster guys, and there's a link right there. You're not going to see a lot of GPUs being sold cheaply recently because of the big Bitcoin or cryptocurrency mining craze. A lot of people are buying these GPUs because that particular chip is perfect for the type of thing cryptocurrency and gaming requires. But let me save that for a future lesson. So here are some sticks of RAM. This is just some of the many shapes and sizes that RAM can come in. Okay, so let's get into the numbers now. Even if a computer has 4 gigabytes of RAM, you can still assume it'll have a 64-bit instruction set on the chip. But anything higher, stuck with a 32-bit CPU, would be a waste of RAM because 32-bit processors are only useful up to 4 gigabytes. There are a lot of videos out there that I'd recommend you watching to better understand how the instruction set connects to RAM. I will have a future lesson on that as well, but for today's lesson, we really want to focus on your ability to deduce why a certain amount of RAM is useful to only particular types of processors. And how would you do that? Well, we have to really get into some numbers here. The 32-bit chips are no longer sold with mainstream computers. In the advertising, you'll still see things like this: a Z83W fanless mini PC desktop, Windows 10, 64-bit Intel X5 Z8350. Okay, so that's the name of the chip right there. But you'll still see advertisers will say things like 64-bit as if it's impressive, as if not every single chip being made nowadays is a 64-bit chip. So let's take a closer look at this particular computer. In addition to it saying 64-bit, which is so unnecessary here, maybe they add this number because when I looked closer into this computer, I noticed it only had 2 gigabytes of RAM. But if you want to upgrade or add more, maybe you can. So maybe that's why they want to emphasize the fact that it's 64-bit, so that you know if you add more RAM, then you'll be able to utilize the fact that its instruction set is a 64-bit instruction set. Or if you want to use an app that requires a 64-bit address, then you can. However, I think it still will run pretty slow. So let's take a break here and reflect. I've given you 2 numbers and 2 cases in which we can find ourselves in a situation where one or the other is just overkill. In your own words, I want you to describe one of those examples to me. And if you need help here, here's a sentence starter. You can say something like, having 8 gigabytes of RAM with a, and then go ahead and tell me some numbers about a CPU and why or why not it would be bad or overkill. Okay, so now that we're nailing down the fact that these numbers, the amount of RAM, that is storage, and the ability for a processor to process things, now that we have a number to associate with the processor, let's back up and just ask ourselves, what is an instruction set? It says here that it's a number of commands or instructions that a CPU can carry out. So if hertz, remember I said gigahertz earlier, gigahertz would be 1,000,000,000 hertz. So if hertz is the number of processes a CPU can carry out in a second, a 32 or 64-bit instruction set is the amount of places a CPU can go in order to carry out one of those instructions. So when I say instructions, that could be something as simple as just adding. So imagine that. I want the computer to go to a storage location, an address, pick up a number, then go to another address, pick up another number, and then add those 2 together. That would be the instruction. And thus, you could see the word set in there. It would be taking a set of numbers and adding them. So on this slide here, I'm saying that, in other words, calling an instruction set a something like 32-bit, it's ironic because I'm not saying you could have 4 billion instructions. That's what a 32-bit number can get you, is roughly up to the number 4 billion. It's not like an instruction set is referring to 4 billion instructions. It's giving you up to 4 billion addresses to go to and then do something with. So that 32-bit number can take you to 4 billion different places. So in your own words, what's an instruction set? If you need to go back and pause and read and review to answer this, go ahead. And so at this point, you should be feeling pretty good because you know what RAM is, or at least you know the purpose of RAM, and you know what an instruction set is. Before, we've talked about binary math, so you should be good with that. And then we took binary and turned it into hexadecimal so humans can understand that binary a lot better. After all that, we've talked about how light bulbs light up, so you know some basics about electricity. Now, we're going so deep as to talk about data storage, and remember what data could be. It could be letters like ASCII, and letters, come together to make words, or it could be images. When we talked about black and white images, how that encoding happens, that's a lot easier to wrap your mind around. So again, talking about ones and zeros there. So you know that this data is stored, and now you're understanding how the processor goes and retrieves it, and some numbers associated with that retrieval process. So here's our big digestion activity of the day, and then we're done. And this is the moment I said you'll have a chance for some creativity. So if I asked you to create a program where I needed to save the word hello, and then the program asks the user to type in their name, now we have a situation where you'll store the ASCII values for the word hello at a particular address. I wonder if you see where I'm going with this. The computer saves this word hello, and then the user types in their name, so the computer will have to save that value as well. And then the program will tell the computer to go get hello, go get the person's name, put them together so it could say something like hello Bob. All because to a computer everything is numbers, and to be exact, everything is binary numbers. So I want you to visually show this to me. Whether you write a paragraph or you do a poster or drawing, I'm looking for visual proof that you're understanding what I am saying here. And if you need an example, one's coming up. And I'm going to be very accepting of the type of person who might want to just mentally imagine an activity if they're not really a kinesthetic learner themselves. I wish I had the supplies for us to maybe get like some buckets and string and be even more creative that way, so we can show bits moving back and forth from the CPU and the RAM. But should we do an activity where we write down the ASCII value for every word we want to say, and then write the binary equivalent, and then string those numbers together in 8-bit chunks and place them in a 32-bit address? That kind of sounds like a lot of work, so I'm going to give you a cheat here to get that done pretty quickly. My Think Right Share here, and your last one of the day, is simply to either do the exercise I describe or you describe what you would have done, so using your imagination. So here's my example. I'm not going to read it, but here's an example of a good couple of paragraphs. Where you're mentally stepping through each part of this activity. Let me just show you the poster I created. It is horrible and not the best piece of artwork, but I like it. So here I've created a giant rectangle that denotes RAM, and here is our CPU. It is a small one, 32-bit instruction set. And remember, anytime somebody says a 64-bit system or a 64-bit CPU or 64-bit instruction set, they're talking about the same thing. And what is that thing? It is a concept that using a 32 or 64, let's go with the smaller number just because it's easier to visualize. So we have a 32-bit system here. Here's our CPU. Here's our main chip. So a 32-bit number can give us 4 billion different decimal numbers. So when I say 32 bits, I mean 1 bit, 2 bit, 3 bit, count all the way up to 32, and each bit can either be 1 or a 0, and then you know binary math, so you know how those ones and zeros can be mixed in different ways to represent different numbers. Okay, so what that means is you can essentially have 4 billion addresses on RAM. But that wouldn't make a lot of sense, because the whole purpose of having an address, and that's what I have in black right here, these are just 2 examples of an address. Right here I just wanted to give you a zoomed in version of my really crummy drawing, and just notice right here that I have address to value ratio with bytes, that is. So like I said before, this is still a 4-byte address, and there are 3 bytes inside of this address. So it's a 1 to 3 ratio, and then up here it's just a 1 to 5. So they vary. The whole point of having an address is so you could tell the computer, go to this address and get this stored data. And we're talking about RAM, so this isn't meant to be stored long term. Later on, I drew a picture that said to the hard drive down here, so you could tell the computer to take what's in RAM and put it on a hard drive. That's what happens when you click save. So with that said, you could put 4 billion addresses on here, but that wouldn't make a lot of sense because why would you have an address with nothing there? So in this situation, we have an address with 5 bytes of data. These 5 bytes of data represent the word hello, the example we're talking about. And so here's one of the cheats I was telling you about. If you wanted to create your own poster similar to this or whatever, write your paragraph, you could go to a website that does this ASCII to hex translator or converter, and I just typed in the word hello. It gave me in hexadecimal the value for each of those letters, and so I just copied it here. I didn't have to do all the math myself. Something I want you to notice is how long is this hex address. So 1 through 8, I just did 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 here. Each hex digit or hexadigit is a nibble, meaning 4 bits. So if I have 2 hex digits, I have 1 byte. So if we count them, 1, 2, 3, 4, an address is 4 bytes long. Down here, going with the same concept, I have a 4-byte address. It says dead beef, but this is a hexadecimal number because D, E, A, B, F, these are letters in the number system we call hexadecimal. And then notice, this is me pretending that the user used a keyboard down here and typed in Bob, so they typed in their name. Well, this 4-byte address only has 3 bytes of data in it, and that's okay. The top one has 5. It just depends on what you're doing with your program and how much you want to manage memory. So once the CPU can talk to the RAM in that way, once that happens, the RAM can tell the CPU what data it needs, and if it's just adding these 2 numbers, then out here on the screen, it'll light up those pixels. You could barely see it in the picture, but I have little dots here, and it just says hello and then plus Bob. So this is just an example of how you use RAM and the CPU together to create a situation where you can go to different addresses. And remember, the whole purpose of RAM is so that this can be done very, very fast. So create your own thing and let me know how I can help. If you're enjoying this topic, I found a new website today called WikiChip. It is the preeminent resource for computer architectures and semiconductor engineering. WikiChip covers historical and contemporary electronic systems and technologies as well as related topics. It's a very fascinating website, and it'll give you a lot of these numbers that we went over today. Here's a quick hint to your DOL. What you'll want to do is a little rapid research here. If you were to click on this link I'm providing, you'll go to a website that looks like this. This is kind of like a link to a data sheet. So this is the Intel Core 2 dual processor. There's just a lot of helpful information for you to look at. And notice right here it says instruction set. Then it says how many bits that the instruction set is. The last thing I wanted to say to make sure you're very mindful of this is there are not any CPUs being built that are 32-bit anymore, at least not that I know of. And a great way to remember this is that a 32-bit CPU is for old computers. Maybe you have a really old one and that might have a 32-bit instruction set. There's ways you could find out. Just ask me later, I'll show you how. But I used 32 bits the entire lesson because it's a much easier number to wrap our minds around, which is kind of ironic because that number, a 32-bit instruction set, has 4 billion values. 4 billion is still way easier to wrap our mind around than 16 exabytes. That's what a 64-bit instruction set gives us. So I was just working with a smaller, more manageable number. Okay, and then a great way to remember this is now that LeBron James is going to the Lakers. Think of LeBron James as a 64-bit. He is the new man in town. The old star, the 32-bit, is Kobe in this scenario. All right, so with that being the end of the lesson, we're in IB school, so let's go ahead and do some reflecting so we can gain these interpersonal skills that are important in life. Think about this lesson and which one of these attributes do you think this lesson was an example of? So then just fill in that sentence. Today's lesson was all about being what? There's no wrong answer here. And here's my DOL for you. Michael Burnham is on eBay looking for a computer. She sees someone post a custom gaming PC with an Intel Core dual processor T2400 and 8 gigabytes of RAM. She thinks the person posting must have meant to type either Intel Core i5 750, maybe they typed in the wrong chip, or maybe they typed in the wrong size of RAM. Whatever it is, she suspects it's a typo, so your job here is to deduce why she thinks this must be a typo using at least 2 details from our lesson today. And now that you're done with that, I just wanted to address 2 things really quick. The first is some people have asked me why I have so many Think Right shares. I'm a big believer in writing to learn. At least it helps me learn to write things down, even if I never read them again. And I think this connects to my belief that if you cannot explain something easily, then I just don't think you actually know that thing that you claim to know. And here I'm saying, sure, you may be able to do tricks or make certain things work that are related to the concept that we're going over. But again, if you can't write it, if you can't express it or speak it, I just don't really believe you know as much as you claim. So speaking of which, this was a particularly hard lesson for me to explain. I had to do a lot of research beforehand. So I just wanted to say, use other people in your education. If you go to YouTube and just type in instruction set, there's a lot of great videos there. And just don't forget, variety and diversity are good things. And that at the end of the day, I'm here to work with you and help you on your path. So let me know what I can do to drive home these ideas we covered today in a better way.